Away.
Sure. So everybody can see my screen.
Yes.
Got it.
All right, so here today to talk about MBTA ferry service and specifically focus on the recent seasonal expansion services that we started during the Sumner Tunnel closure, and actually one of them started last fall. That was the East Boston Ferry. So just getting into a little bit of the background here to provide some context for how these services came about. MassDOT closed the Sumner Tunnel, which connects East Boston and the airport to downtown Boston on weekends during the spring, and then 7 days a week from July 5th to August 31st. And for several months leading up to that, MassDOT, the MBTA, and a group of stakeholders sort of explored and discussed a variety of mitigations, transportation mitigations for the Sumner Tunnel closure. And among the suite of mitigations that that actually went forward, which included MBTA fare mitigations on transit and on commuter rail, expanded parking, and in some cases free parking. One of the key mitigations put in place was some additional ferry services, namely the East Boston, Lynn, and Winthrop ferries. So the East Boston ferry service actually started the prior fall, in fall of 2022 in September, and there was a piece of legislation that mandated and funded that service for as long as the funding would allow. It was a $1 million earmark essentially for the East Boston service. So we started it in the fall, ran it through the end of November last year, and then started it up again in late March of spring of 2023. Let me see. And then we added the Lynn and Winthrop ferries, specifically coincident with the Sumner Tunnel closure. And then, as I'll explain a little bit here, extended them beyond the end of the Sumner Tunnel closure to continue for the rest of the summer fall 2023 season, and then of course with the intention of starting them up again in spring of 2024 and operating them through the end of the summer fall 2024 season at a minimum, with future extensions and permanent service to be discussed. That's still a policy decision that's sitting with the Commonwealth. Let me see if I can advance the slide here. Okay, so talking a little bit about these individual routes, the East Boston Ferry, we operated 22 trips on weekdays and 19 trips on weekends. It operates between Long Wharf in Boston and Lewis Mall in East Boston. The fare was set as the same as the subway fare because it is sort of a redundant service to the Blue Line. And then during the Sumner Tunnel closure, like the Blue Line, it was free. The Lynn Ferry, we operated 10 trips, weekdays only, between Long Wharf and the Blossom Street Pier in Lynn. The full fare is $7, which is similar to the commuter rail fare to Lynn Station. And during the Sumner Tunnel closure, the fare mitigation was $2.40. Winthrop Ferry, it's 6 trips on weekdays, and it's kind of an interesting schedule, which we can talk a little bit later. It serves Long Wharf in downtown Boston, but also has stops at the Seaport and Logan Airport and Quincy, in addition to Winthrop. Not all routes serve all of those stops, so it is sort of a different schedule than the MBTA would normally operate for a ferry service, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But what we attempted to do when we took over the service from Winthrop was, as closely as possible, mirror the existing service that was being provided by Winthrop with the vessel that was provided by Winthrop as well. And again, the fare there is $6.50 normally, and it was reduced to $2.40 during the Sumner Tunnel closure. So just before we get into a little bit more detail about ridership, the original plan was to conclude the ferry services the expanded ferry services at the end of the normal summer fall ferry season, which we have traditionally for the permanent ferry routes. The Charlestown and Hingham Hull ferries operate year round on weekdays, but there is weekend Hingham Hull ferry service that is seasonal only and ends traditionally around the weekend of Indigenous Peoples Day. So, in keeping with the end of the normal ferry season, the original plan was for the expansion services, the East Boston, Winthrop, and Lynn ferries to also end that same weekend, in line with the traditional end of the season. And then just due to the popularity of the services, the enthusiasm surrounding the services, and our limited ability to keep them running for, say, another month or so, we operated the Lynn ferry through the end of October, and we were able to operate the East Boston and Winthrop ferries through the end of November. The reason for the difference there is that the East Boston and Winthrop ferries are inner harbor services in protected waters, and the Lynn ferry operates in open water and is subject to heavy seas. We did have at least one day this season where we had to cancel all trips on the Lynn ferry due to high seas. Also, interestingly, with the Lynn ferry, even if we were to say we wanted to be cautious and conservative and say that we were going to operate it beyond October and just warn folks that we'd have to cancel in the event of heavy seas, for this particular vessel that we're using to operate the Lynn ferry, the lease with the owner stipulates that we can't operate the service using that vessel beyond October 31st. And then again, we plan, our plan right now is to resume all of these services in spring of 2024, although an actual start date has not been established yet. So looking at the ridership that we had, this chart shows the ridership for all of our ferry services, including the original routes, and it has the ridership for the new routes here too. So as you can see, that the Hingham, Hull, and Charlestown services, which are well-established sort of legacy routes, if you will, have pretty high ridership. They have a pretty committed, regular commuter ridership. And then the expansion services actually did quite well. In particular, I think everybody would acknowledge that the Lynn ferry performed better than expected, but still seeing a lower ridership for those expansion routes, which are newer than we're used to seeing for the original routes. And then you can see here, I talked a little bit about the seasonal drop off. It's just pretty standard that in as you get into the cooler months, I should say, into the fall, you see the ridership drop off, because then it's really your hardcore commuters and many fewer leisure riders. So you can see right there in September, there's a pretty significant drop off on all services, really, all ferry services, with the Hingham service retaining the highest percentage of its year-round ridership, and then it really just drops off in September and October on all services after that. So in terms of other ferry initiatives underway, what we're looking to do, sort of our vision, just internally with the MBTA, we are planning to expand the ferry fleet. We know that the administration is focused on water transportation, investing in water transportation and expanding it. There are a number of requests from other cities and towns on the North Shore and the South Shore that would like to see expanded ferry services, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to address and respond to that. But in terms of maintaining, maximizing, optimizing, and expanding existing ferry services that we just talked about, we need additional ferry vessels. The vessels that we acquired for the expansion services, one of which was the Valkyrie for the Winthrop ferry. That vessel is leased from the town of Winthrop, and it had just recently undergone a significant overhaul and continued to struggle throughout the season with various mechanical issues that caused cancellations and delays here and there. It actually is currently out of service with a mechanical failure, has been for the last several weeks, and we've been using the Flying Cloud to support that service, but that's not a sustainable solution going into next season. So the Valkyrie will be back for next season, but and then moving on to the Lynn ferry, as I said before, the leased vessel that we have has some pretty restrictive terms in it, and if we were looking to expand, the frequency or the seasonality of the Lynn ferry, then we need to be supplementing with an additional vessel as well. So the two lines we have in the water right now are we are exploring a direct procurement of a vessel that's available for sale. I have a report from the consultants, the technical experts that went to go inspect that vessel. And so I think we'll have a decision in the next month or so about whether or not we're actually going to buy that vessel. It seems like we probably will. Although one of the things that came back in the report is that we would need about $1 million worth of accessibility modifications to that boat. And accessibility is another area that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So the reason why it's so difficult to find ferry vessels that are suitable for the MBTA service is because most of the vessels that are available in the market, which there are fewer than you would think, we've done an exhaustive search, and it just, to meet the needs of our service, there's not a lot that's readily available. Certainly the ones that are available generally don't meet our accessibility standards, nor are they ADA compliant, which is a requirement for us. So I don't think it's a showstopper. I think our recommendation as the ferry department will be that we procure the vessel and we invest to make the accessibility modifications. But just to sort of parlay that into the next subject, the excitement and the attention and the enthusiasm around water transportation just with the Sumner Tunnel closure kind of exposed something that had been overlooked for our legacy ferry services, which is that we have been operating vessels and using facilities that don't meet our own accessibility standards and are not ADA compliant, which is not really something that I think came to anybody's attention because the Charlestown and Hingham Hull services have been operating as they are for a while. And, there certainly were no complaints, it never turned up in any kind of an investigation or an audit. And so now what really triggered this was that we had a complaint, an accessibility complaint about the Lynn Ferry facility infrastructure in Boston, not at the Blossom Street Pier, but at Long Wharf. The pitch of the ramp was too steep, and some wheelchair users could not actually use the ramp. So in the middle of the ferry season this year, we relocated the Lynn Ferry to a different part of Long Wharf and used a different ramp that is accessible and does meet our accessibility standard. But it was that particular customer complaint and the ensuing investigation and mitigation that caused us in our system-wide accessibility department to sort of broaden the scope and look at all of our ferry facilities and all of our vessels. And what we found is that we have some pretty significant gaps in terms of accessibility with our vessels and our ferry facilities, which we will have to address. Certainly, we don't have the capital funding available in the CIP to make all those investments now. And it doesn't mean that we need to stop those services, and it won't stop us from continuing to provide ferry service, but they are priority investments that we will need going forward, especially as we consider expansion services and continuing the expansion services. There's really going to be an expectation, because there are certain rules that the FTA imposes around expansion services as opposed to existing services. We will have to make those compliant and accessible. So that is something that we're actively working on now. And in the current CIP cycle, we did put in a project request for accessibility funding for ferry vessels and facilities. The other line we have in the water for a new boat is we applied for an FTA passenger ferry grant to procure an additional ferry. Now, this would not be for an existing boat. This would be for the design build of a brand new ferry to our specifications. So that's not a tomorrow solution. That's, it likely will take 3 to 5 years to go through that process and actually have a usable vessel. Whereas the vessel that we are looking to procure directly in the near term should be here for the next season. Let me stop there. Any questions before I talk about what else we currently have in the pipeline in terms of our ferry plans? Any questions about accessibility, boats?
Yeah, so just to confirm that the vessel that is currently being reviewed that you're recommending, ferry department's recommending for purchase, that would be for the Lynn ferry that would enable it to be permanent service, or?
Well, so that's not my call. That's not my decision. So
No,
what it would
no.
enable us to do is supplement the current vessel. So, depending on what the demand is, I mean, it's a new service and we think there's potential to slot in additional trips. There's not really an indication that we need twice the service right now for Lynn, but it would adding another boat to our current fleet in general would enable us to have redundancy on certain routes, probably add another trip or two on the Lynn service, and potentially add another trip or two on Hingham Hall weekends where we are routinely leaving people on the dock on nice summer days. So we currently have a demand problem, which is a good problem to have on the Hingham Hall ferry on summer weekends. So we know we need an additional boat there. We don't operate the Lynn ferry on weekends currently, so the additional boat would be able to fill a number of gaps throughout the system, not just supporting the Lynn ferry alone.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I thought you said something along the lines of the new boat would solve the problem with the Lynn ferry, that the lease limits it to not operating past October 31st.
It would help mitigate it, meaning that
Yeah.
potentially, I mean, again, we're only at this point, we'd only be talking about another month for November, right? So it would create the opportunity for somebody above my pay grade to make an operating decision that we would use the additional boat to operate the Lynn ferry in the month of November. And then again, that's the one that even operating it in October, which we can do, and we did largely without a problem in October. We just need passengers and stakeholders to understand the disclaimer that that's the one where if there's heavy seas, we'll have to cancel with relatively short notice.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mike, commissioning a vessel is great news, and that'd be great, amazing. Are you looking at electrification or of that as a possible propulsion method?
So there's more to come on electrification. That we did not necessarily put electrification in the spec for the grant application. That doesn't necessarily preclude it if that's something we wanted to do when it came time, like if we were awarded the grant. So in thinking about the administration's plans for future water transportation investment and expansion, those are things that really need to be further studied and fleshed out by the MassDOT planning department and by the administration. So we've had a number of meetings internally, again, with MassDOT colleagues and with folks from the Gov's office and the LG's office to talk about what are the Commonwealth's objectives for water transportation. I mean, it seems clear that water transportation is kind of expansion of water transportation, further investment in water transportation is an objective, but understand exactly what that means. What is the policy framework around, we're hearing from a number of municipalities that they would like ferry service, but what's the policy framework for evaluating which municipalities, should be getting MBTA ferry service versus not, and these are not always such straightforward answers, right? Like, for example, the GM was recently within the last couple of months, speaking to a group in Salem, a stakeholder group in Salem. Again, not the mayor, but a different stakeholder group. And one of the questions they asked is, will the MBTA be taking over the Salem ferry? And it seemed like that's something that they wanted, that group. Now, the Salem ferry right now is not purely a commuter vessel. It doesn't operate a commuter schedule. It's sort of a tourist ferry. And, our response is, sure, if that's a request, it's something that we would look into in addition with all these other requests. But it's not at all clear that that is an ask from the city of Salem, or that there's an actual demand for that ferry service in its current form to be taken over by the MBTA and operated as a commuter ferry, like what we're doing in Lynn and Winthrop, right? So, the MBTA is the operator, and some of these decisions about, requests for ferry services from Gloucester or Beverly, or an increased ferry frequency from Quincy, these things need to be put through some sort of a policy framework and evaluated, and decisions made by folks that are not, the MBTA ferry operations department, if that makes sense. Because it needs to be put in the context of the broader transportation and economic picture for the whole
Yeah.
region.
Yeah. I hear
Right?
Worcester wants ferry service too. It's just everywhere now.
Boat envy. No, I'll tell you though, we're excited about ferry service. It's exciting, and it's not that there's no infrastructure costs, because ferry facilities and docks do cost money, but the infrastructure costs, as you can all imagine, are much less significant and onerous than, say, South Coast Rail or any other sort of rail extension or rail project, which makes ferries as a mode very, very appealing, not just for the customer. I mean, it is a very civilized way to commute. I've taken the Lynn Ferry. I'm a North Shore guy, and I've taken the Lynn Ferry a number of times, and it's just, if you're able to do it, if you can afford it, and you have the time, because it's definitely not faster than the train, but it's a very nice way to commute.
And just quick follow up, and I don't want to take all your time.
Sure.
Are we constrained at all in Boston to accept additional service? In other words, to the wharfs and the ramps and everything, can we have enough, or do we need to go somewhere else for it?
It depends. So we can support the existing service with some increases in frequency of the existing routes, is how I would answer that. As we start looking into, different planning studies and planning initiatives for additional routes, it probably could get pretty crowded and constrained there in Boston. However, one advantage is that our ferry operator also operates a lot of the other, whale watching and sightseeing excursions at the same facilities. So, to the extent that there could be some coordination required to make room for boats, the current ferry operator is well positioned to do that, to make those accommodations, right? In terms of like balancing the schedule for all those other operations along with MBTA ferry operations. The other thing that we would look into, quite frankly, although it's not like we're ready to put an RFP out on the street, but if we're going to expand ferry services, there may be an opportunity to have multiple operators. We know there are other operators, and that is one of the reasons why the MBTA is interested in buying and leasing our own vessels, because the more vessels that we have at our disposal, the bigger the pool of operator candidates we could have. Because if you're not requiring an operator to supply their own vessel, that sort of expands the pool of potential operators. So in terms of staffing the department, that's another thing that we're looking to do. You may get a chuckle. There is no real ferry department at the MBTA. So the ferry operation, which is small and it's pretty turnkey in terms of contract oversight and planning, has been operated by MBTA Railroad Operations, the same department that oversees the commuter rail contract, just forever. And so there's currently no one MBTA employee who's solely devoted to just the ferry operation or the ferry contracts. It's sort of an other duties as assigned type of thing for the whole team at MBTA Railroad Operations. So, and honestly, that's not necessarily a complaint, because it's been very manageable. As I said, particularly before the expansion services, the contracts with the ferry operator, unlike the commuter rail contract, are very turnkey. It's pretty basic. The operator gets a schedule, which is kind of directed by the MBTA, but it's also based on what's possible, right? Every ferry route has assigned vessels, and it has a trip duration, and there's an assigned crew, And the schedule is essentially based on how many runs the crew can get out of that particular route in a given service day. It's as simple as that, which is why a short route like East Boston, you can get a lot more trips out of than, say, a longer haul route like Lynn, where it's a 35, 40-minute trip. You allow for a 10-minute turn time, and then you've got a 90-minute headway in the best of times, if you're using one boat and one crew, right? So what we're looking to do is we're hiring the first ever director of ferry operations, who will be a full-time, 100% employee focused only on ferries and not commuter rail. And that person will report to me for the time being. Then in addition, a little bit further down the road, as part of General Manager Phil Eng's reorganization of MBTA operations, there is talk of establishing an executive director of water transportation. So one of the things that Phil's doing is looking at the model of executive director for commuter rail and establishing an executive director for every mode. So that's currently in the works. There have not been selections made for those other modes at this point, but on that list, at least tentatively, is an executive director for water transportation. So, I mean, these types of decisions are always subject to change, but right now it seems like the new director of ferry operations, whoever he or she may be, would report to me until such time that there is the establishment of a separate ferry department led by an executive director for water transportation, at which time that employee and any future ferry staff would report to that other executive director in that department. Certainly that makes a lot of sense, given that the Commonwealth, MassDOT, the MBTA are looking to further expand ferry operations in the future, buy more boats, get more operators, start more routes, do more planning studies, make pretty significant investments in accessibility. Certainly warrants a dedicated team that's not dividing their time between commuter rail and ferry. And then the last thing, which I skipped over this one bullet, and this is kind of what I alluded to earlier about the Winthrop ferry. One of the things we're doing in the off season is assessing the efficiency of the existing the existing routes that we operated for the expansion services for this past season. It was the first time. We now have ridership data on a per day, per trip basis. And so we're in a position to make some tweaks as needed based on demand and operational efficiency in advance of the next season, which would start in the spring and into the summer. So one of the ones we're focused on in particular is the Winthrop ferry, which, even though we call it the Winthrop ferry, it serves a number of other ports of call. So Quincy, the Seaport, and Logan Airport. One of the things that we've heard consistently, and I believe, I'm not too far out over my skis saying this, that the town of Winthrop heard, even when they were operating the ferry, is that, there might be better ridership if the routes weren't so complicated and there weren't so many stops that sort of caused a longer than necessary trip duration time for some of the routes. So what we would look to do, it would be a proposal that would be considered up the line, is to try to streamline those Winthrop ferry routes and see if the way that the different stops are served can be rationalized a little bit better. I don't think we're looking to drop any of the stops entirely, but look at, is there a way to rationalize that schedule just a little bit differently, so that, some of those routes and stops are not organized the way they are in the current schedule that we took over from Winthrop. And then, as I said a little bit before, with Lynn, it's pretty basic, right? That ferry goes back and forth from Long Wharf to Lynn. What we would really be looking for there is if we were able to put this second vessel in service and create an additional round trip or two, where in the schedule would those be slotted in? And just the last slide. Oh, go ahead, Mayor.
No, go ahead. No, you first. Yeah.
The last slide here is in here just for context more than anything. Not to say that any of this is driven by financial considerations. It's really not. As I said, the Commonwealth is very interested in continuing these services and continuing to invest and expand in ferry services. But just for context, the historical ferry budget has been around $20 million a year for just the existing routes, the Hingham, Hull, Charlestown routes. Just this fiscal year is 21.7 million. And then the costs just associated with just this past season for the expansion services were 4.3 million. And then we were able to leverage a total of 6.7 million in one-time state money that we're able to use over 2 years for those expansion services. But in terms of continuing these services into the future, just for context, the MBTA would be looking for some kind of an appropriation from the legislature or additional operating revenue, because again, the benefits, the economic benefits to the Commonwealth are what's important. But I think the MBTA has some pretty well publicized financial challenges on the horizon, and so it's not really sustainable to add and continue to add additional services that are operating at a deficit. So again, just for context, not in any way suggesting that these decisions are financially motivated. They're not. More often than not, the decisions are made, and then there's a scramble to sort of find the money, because they're, as I said, that they're part of a bigger transportation vision for the Commonwealth that's not financially constrained in that sense. But there is indeed a financial impact of adding additional services and operations that are not funded.
Sure is.
That's all. Go ahead, Brian. That's all that I brought, just to brief the group on. Happy to go back and look at any of the other slides, answer any questions, engage in a discussion. One thing I will say, unfortunately, there's still a lot we don't know about the exact nature of the administration's goals and objectives and vision for water transportation. I think, to be perfectly candid, and I don't think that they would disagree, it's not really nailed down and specific at this time. It's sort of a broad vision. We're in favor of ferries, and we're in favor of expanding the ferry services that we have where it makes sense to do so. What's a little bit elusive at this moment is, what does that mean? Where does it make sense? How do we evaluate this? Where does the funding come from? Are there sort of frequency targets the way that we have for commuter rail modernization and for the subway? Are there ridership projections for different parts of the region? These are all things that the MassDOT Planning Office is going to have to assist us with digging into a bit.
Yeah, the policy framework you mentioned is really
Yes.
critical there, and obviously, if the advisory board can help, we're here and willing to do our part.
Mike, that was terrific. Thank you so much for the presentation. I can say that we have been thrilled with how everything has gone here in Lynn with our ferry. So thank you so much to you and your team. I know all the folks that have been a part of that from our side. We really enjoy working with you on that. On that last slide there, clearly understand that everything has financial implications. Does the T use some kind of metric? So when you're saying there's an operating deficit, do you use some kind of metric to have a estimation of the all-in cost, blending the operating and capital, so the financial viability of these different modes of transportation? Because as you said, the ferry is very low capital cost relative to other modes.
So relative to other modes, it's very low cost of capital. It's a really good question to see. I know that we have to report all of this information to the National Transit Database maintained by the FTA, and there may be some analysis available using their website to answer that question. I would say, purely from an operating perspective, there's not a transit agency or a transit mode in the world that operates in the black. Basically, the international gold standard for a really efficient operation is 50% revenue recovery. right? So if you, if the revenue is 50% of the operating costs, that, at least a public transportation service, then that's a really effective, successful service. And clearly that in every instance is operating at a deficit. So this is not to suggest in any way, Mayor, that the ferries are unique in that regard. That's true of all of the MBTA's services. And part of the reason that I was like, not dismissive, but sort of like signaling not to get too hung up on the cost as a factor in the decision is because there's commuter rail routes and bus routes and subway routes that operated much more significant deficits than these ferry routes, and we will continue to operate them. So that, I guess, that kind of speaks to your point, and it's particularly when you factor in the capital investments, it becomes even more so, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and you were very clear that that was not the driver, and I appreciate that. I do, you also mentioned that this T is going to be seeking funding sources for that, and that while you might not be making that point, others may, and only the T can answer this question about what the actual long-term costs are. And so if there's a way to, illustrate that with a blended operating capital, I think it would be really helpful. So I raise it, one, on the point about the expansion and the financial, need that's going to present. But I also raise from a question about the fares. Is that a policy that the T has to set the fares based on the commuter rail? Because from our community's perspective, we think the commuter rail pricing is unfair in that the distance we are to Boston relative to a place like Revere that pays half, third of the price, and so for us to then tie that to this new mode of transportation seems like it creates an unnecessary barrier for our residents to use this amazing new, mode of transportation.
Yeah. So, I don't want to make it seem like I'm passing the buck on this, but the folks that operate the modes don't have anything to do with fare policy. But the MBTA in general, as I'm sure you probably know, is in the middle of a number of fare policy evaluations to consider some of the points that you're making. And I know that the administration, and then also we hear a lot from the Wu administration from the city about fare policy. So there are a number of studies, analyses, and initiatives ongoing right now. I think there's an upcoming board presentation on means tested fares. That's not the be all end all. That's just one program that, potentially in a suite of future programs. I can tell you, even though I don't have answers, the fare policy team, who I'm in frequent contact with, has a number of studies ongoing right now looking at commuter rail and ferry fares for the future. I think the challenge, again, not that it's all about money, is that in any reduced fare program, whether it's writ large or whether it's for select groups of, municipalities, riders, what have you, none of those changes are revenue positive, even though I think we would all very much like that to be the case, that the fares are set at such a low level that ridership increases so disproportionately that it makes even more money. There really aren't any projections that suggest that ends up being true. So this would be a situation where I think if the MBTA was looking to advance, and I am a little bit out of my skis here because fare policy is definitely not my area, but I meet with them enough to feel confident in what I'm saying, that if the MBTA leadership, the MBTA board, was looking to recommend implementing general fare reductions across modes in order to advance some of the economic goals of the region and increase ridership and stuff like that, it would be doing so in a clear-eyed way that it was going to cost additional money, and that would add to the MBTA's operating deficit that it would be looking to the Commonwealth to mitigate in some way, shape, or form, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I absolutely appreciate there's a lot of conversations about the means tested fares and commuter rail fares. In that context is super helpful, and that all makes sense. I guess the more specific question is, for this conversation, is who decides what the ferry fares are, and does that have to be connected to the commuter rail fares?
At this
So,
point, it kind of is per the fare policy department. And that question was never even looked at until these expansion services came about. So just kind of connecting this back to my accessibility comments earlier, the Charlestown and Hingham Hull ferries sort of operated on their own, you know, separate from any sort of consideration of other MBTA modes and what's comparable. And, it seems like folks just didn't pay that close attention to parity between the modes. And then looking at these expansion services and where the fares should be set, that sort of opened up this box of questions about how do we set ferry fares and what should they be? And at least in the interim period, because again, even though I think there's a desire to continue these expansion services, for the purposes of these fare discussions, they were really only looking at these 2 seasons for which the legislature has provided the funding. So, so when Brian was shaking his head earlier, this is a new thing, pegging the ferry fares to the commuter rail, just because that's a mileage based zone system, and so they're essentially using overlaying the zone system to the ferry map, right, and saying this, that the Blossom Street Pier is also in the same zone basically as Lynn Station would be. So certainly understand the comment, that the perspective that maybe doesn't make sense, and just we all know that there are folks that don't think that the commuter rail zone structure makes sense either, and there's a number of different analyses underway to look at alternatives to that as well. So the good news is that the reduced fares will be in effect again during the Sumner Tunnel closure, which means that the East Boston ferry will be free again next July and August, and that the Lynn and Winthrop ferries will be operating at a subway fare for July and August, which, given that the summers are the highest ridership months anyway, I think that fact coupled with the reduced fare should really give us a real sense of the ongoing viability, demand, et cetera, for these services. I'm pretty confident that that we'll be able to continue them. It's just I can't definitively say that, and I guess more to come.
Thank you.
Mike, I guess just one final question from me is: has the authority looked at the Lovejoy Wharf Seaport service, possibly taking that over? And I ask because I brought those boats to Boston once upon a time in a past life, and they're near and dear to my heart, and I'd love to see the T running them someday.
So we have not. I don't know if it's in the stack of pending asks. I mean, as you can imagine, and I'm not being flippant sassy, the excitement around the ferries this past summer means that everybody's asking us to take over all the ferries, right?
Sure. Sure.
And that's sort of what we need: a policy framework and some additional analysis and help and some clarity from the administration about how we should be looking into those individual requests and sort of evaluating them, right? But I don't think that's an out of bounds question, right? It seems like if we're considering all these other ferries, why wouldn't we consider that too, if that's an ask?
Cool.
Well, if there's anything that the committee can do to help, as Brian suggested, let us know.
Well, I do think at the right time, once there's a little bit more clarity about what sort of MassDOT studies will be kicked off, I think it makes a lot of sense to seek input from this group. Kind of the way that, Brian, you may recall, we had a Rail Vision advisory group during that study, just to take input from municipal leaders, advocates, other stakeholders, because that's going to be some really important information as we try to figure out how best to serve the transportation needs of the region.
Right?
And sorry, quickly, when do you
Yeah,
think
sure.
the ferry person is going to be on board, the new hire?
So we're doing interviews starting next week and into December. So I would expect to make a selection before the end of the calendar year. And then that person will be onboarded in probably January of 24.
Well, we will very much look forward, I'm sure, to meeting that person and offering our support.
We have a good pool of internal and external candidates that we're interviewing too, so it'll be interesting to see. Surprising to learn that some colleagues at the T who don't currently have very much to do with the ferry operation or oversight of the contracts actually do have maritime experience, in some cases Coast Guard experience, naval experience. So it's fun to learn that about your colleagues when an opportunity like this comes along.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Well, there's nothing to adjourn. This wasn't a formal meeting, right?
No, we're great. Thanks, everybody.
Good. Brian, thank you so much. Haven't had the opportunity to meet all of you formally, but very excited to be on board here. And Mike, thank you so much for the update.